thought it'd be fun and kind of interesting to have you, with a show of hands, tell me out of 1 through 10 how you would rank your current prayer life. So 1 would be abysmal, 10 would be you're a saint and you're the example for the rest of us. Okay, so 1 is I'm terrible at prayer, I don't even know how to start, and I don't do it much at all. 10 would be I pray without ceasing and I am a genius at prayer. You should have been asking me to preach this sermon. Okay, so show me 1 through 10. I'm sure that put most of us around 5 somewhere, but let's all show our hands, 1 through 10. Right now, you have 2 hands, you can use them, unless you are somehow disabled or unable to do it, then of course I don't mean to single you out. But everyone whose hands are functional, please show me with a show of hands, 1 through 10. I'm going to say maybe 6. I'm going to say 6. Okay. All right, raise your hand, just one hand in the air if you were over a 5. Raise your hand up high, so I know how many of you thought you were above a 5. Come on, all you arrogant people, put them up there. Okay, I said 6. I said 7, I thought, some of these people know me better. Okay, how many of you said you were under a 5? Okay, good, your hands do work. Okay, so you just have a really low view of your own prayer lives. Well, then this sermon may be of benefit to you. I think about Jesus. You might not be surprised by that, I'm a pastor. I think about Jesus sometimes. And as I read the Gospels, I think about the story, the trajectory of his life on earth, the years that are captured for us, most especially his adult ministry years, those anywhere from 1.5 years to 3 years, we can't be certain, that he walked in the villages of Judea and in the towns and met with people and healed people and performed miracles and fed masses and preached and, what we're going to see today, prayed and spent time in solitude. And I realize I want all the first parts of that, and I don't think about the prayer and solitude part. I want Jesus to use me to help people, to serve people, to feed people, to clothe people, to heal people, to save people in his name. But I forget that the source of that power was rooted in communion with God. Jesus was so committed to prayer and solitude. Throughout his entire ministry, he sets that example. He was surrounded by people most of the time, and yet he went away to be alone. He sought quiet places to commune with God. I thought of a few examples. The Gospel of Mark, chapter 1, verse 35. It says, very early in the morning, while it was still dark, Jesus got up, left the house, and went off to a solitary place where he prayed. So he got up early in the morning just to ditch everybody and have some alone time with God. Jesus begins his day in prayer. He prioritizes connection with God even in the midst of busy ministry life. The Gospel of Luke, chapter 5, verse 16, says that Jesus often withdrew to lonely places to pray. He often withdrew. Some English translations of that Greek phrase for often withdrawing would be that it was his custom to withdraw. It had become customary for Jesus to go away into the quiet to pray. So Luke goes further than Mark. He says Jesus didn't just get up one morning and go pray. He did this all the time. It was his custom to go and pray and be alone with God. In the Gospel of Matthew chapter 14, verse 23, after feeding the 5,000, right after feeding thousands of people, he went up on a mountainside by himself to pray. So right as he had completed this great, magnificent task, this miraculous, wonderful working, he goes off to pray. Jesus needed solitude. What he's doing is modeling for us a rhythm, a habit for life of doing and then not doing, of going and then staying. It's counterintuitive in our modern world because we go, and we feel guilty if we ever stop or slow down or stay too long in one place. And so Jesus demonstrates a rhythm of prayer and solitude and then great feats of miraculous strength, right? But all of that is rooted in his prayer and solitude. We can't miss it. The gospel authors, the ones we call the evangelists, who wrote the story of Jesus, they make it clear in all 4 gospels that Jesus was a man of prayer, a man who sought solitude to commune with God. So here's my thesis, my big idea this morning. Like Jesus, we are called to make prayer and solitude with God a priority in life. Not merely to find peace, but to root our lives in the presence of God and to allow the presence of God to therefore shape our identity and our actions, so that everything we say, everything we do, the people that we are becoming, is a reflection of God in whose presence we live. That's why prayer and solitude are important. So then we have to ask the troubling question, why don't we do it? Why don't we pray more? Why don't we spend more time in solitude with God? Why are we not communing like we should? And I have a few bullet points that I've come up with. I initially had 10 of these, and I read them to Ethan, and he said, you need to cut those in half, and a couple of them could be combined. So that's what we've done. We've sort of shorthanded all of this, but there's so many reasons. But here are my top reasons. One, for me, especially with ADHD, unmedicated, I get easily distracted. And so the first point is constant distractions and busyness. How many of you are affected by distractions and busyness? Yeah, that's what I thought. It's the relentless pace of modern life, coupled with the digital world that we live in. Distractions like social media and smartphones, which make it difficult to create space for quiet reflection, for prayer, to be alone with God. Many Christians find themselves too busy to mentally focus on God. It's just hard to do. Often the only times I try to do it are when I'm driving somewhere, or of course, first thing in the morning or last thing before bed. But beyond those, opening and closing my eyes moments, during the day, it's pretty much when I'm driving somewhere, if I remember to pause an audiobook I'm listening to while simultaneously looking at a text at a red light. If I stop all of that for a moment, I'll think, I need to pray. And it's still pretty distracted because, there's someone tailgating me, or more likely, I'm leaving them in the dust because I drive too fast. But I think we find ourselves too busy to do a lot of things. But the one we seem to feel the least guilt about is prayer, so it's the one we make the least time for. When I spend too much time on things other than my kids, I start to notice, and I think, I've got to dedicate some time with my children. Or my spouse, I say, we need to go on a date night this weekend, which we're grateful we just got to do this weekend. And those little moments are special. When I think, this is important, I need to reroute and dedicate some time to this thing, this relationship. Why is it that my relationship with God is always the last one on the list? Maybe that's true for some of you. And so I guess it's also bad priorities. I'm easily distracted, and I'm too busy, and I prioritize incorrectly. But I'm also dealing with this instant gratification disorder, which is something I've made up. But I think it's a real thing that most of us have, an instant gratification disorder. Why, as my friend said recently, why pray for my daily bread when I could just DoorDash it? And that's so good. I don't need God. I can just click buttons and get whatever I need at almost any given moment. When I need almost anything at all, I just take care of it. I make a call. I go online and research it. I ask for help if necessary, and I don't do that much. I try too many things on my own, and then later I have to have help, and it costs even more than what I was trying to save to begin with. Anyway, I want things done right away. I don't want to have to wait. Maybe you understand that, the instant gratification disorder. Modern society promotes immediate results, which completely clashes with the nature of prayer, right? The purpose of prayer is to teach me the virtues of God as I draw near to Him, things like patience and trust. But if I get immediate results every time I punch the prayer button on the machine, then I'm not developing very much patience or trust in God. I'm just getting what I ask for when I ask for it. And so I start to treat God like a cosmic vending machine or like a year-round Santa Claus. And if I'm a good little boy, then I should ask for things and get what I ask for. And if I don't, I throw a tantrum. I don't understand why I didn't get this thing that I thought I should get, especially if I prayed for it, especially if I prayed more than once. Maybe you understand that. If I don't see immediate answers or changes or whatever I'm looking for in my prayers, then I start to feel, and this is the truth of it, I feel discouraged. It's not just that I want it right away and I'm like this bratty kid from a Willy Wonka movie, right? Like, I want it now. It's not just that. It's when I don't get it, I feel sad. I feel somehow discouraged by that. Like, where is God? Why is He not answering my prayer the way I want Him to? And I want it to just be this petty, selfish thing that I could flip a switch and be like, okay, I'm not going to push God like that. I understand I need to wait. But it's not that simple, because there's a part of me that doubts, that worries. Why isn't this happening? And then I often give up praying. not realizing the purpose of the prayer wasn't to get results. It was to be transformed in the presence of God. I lack discipline. That's the third point. I lack discipline. I don't have healthy routines like I should in my life. Some things are pretty routine. I get up and make coffee the same way at basically the same time every morning at our house. I have some routines. But on the whole, my day-to-day schedule it's not organized well enough, and my personal practices in life are not ordered well enough that I make space for prayer, so that it's easy to neglect it because I don't have the discipline to incorporate it in my schedule. If I scheduled a time to pray, that might help, but I don't. I schedule a time to do everything else, but I don't schedule times to pray because that's not very productive or efficient, right? And that leads to the next point, self-reliance and the myth of productivity. I have been raised in the post-industrial technological world. I'm only 32. And so my whole life has been in a world that is consumed with efficiency and productivity. People have become nothing more than numbers on a spreadsheet, and businesses treat them as such. And our entire culture, which is fueled by capitalism, exists to make money and make profits. We'll do that even at the expense of quality. It's quantity over quality every day of the week in the culture in which we live. Pretend it isn't all you want to. And maybe you are a small business owner who still values quality over quantity. But on the whole, the system in which we live, the world in which we operate, especially in the Western American world, it is consumed with productivity. Schools are more concerned about test scores at the end of each year than they are about each individual child. And it's not the teachers or the administrators, it's the school system that is broken. Plenty of the teachers, the educators themselves, and the administrators are wonderful people who love the children, but the systems are broken. Is that making sense? It would be easy to pinpoint somebody and say it's their fault, but it's not really that way. Sin is a systemic problem. It's bigger than one person. It's broken at a macro level. And so we live in that. We live in a world that is misshapen, that is distorted, and values productivity and efficiency over quality and health, holistic wellness. We don't care about that. Now we're finally recognizing that better mental health would lead to greater productivity in the long run. And surprise, surprise, God knew what he was doing all along. But people are dumb, frankly. And now they're dumb and they're depressed. And so what do? We just keep doing the same stupid thing over and over again to ourselves. Prayer doesn't fit in that design. Prayer is not productive. It doesn't feel efficient. Think of all that I could do in that 5 minutes. And instead, I just sit there, maybe talk to God, maybe just listen. I'll rely on my own abilities. I don't have time to connect with God. And then finally, feelings of distance or doubt or guilt. And I think this does cause problems for some people. I don't know that this is my struggle. That's why it's the last one on my list, but maybe this is your struggle. You don't feel close to God. You don't feel like you can talk to him. Maybe you are from one of those toxic upbringings where you think God is this angry grandpa who can't wait to whoop you with his belt. And that seems like a joke, but a lot of people picture God that way. They've been raised to completely misunderstand a loving Father in heaven, and they think of him as an angry judge ready to condemn them to hell. We could talk more about that some other time. It is interesting to me that the book of Acts and the apostles' early preaching never mentions the threat of hell, not even once. You know they didn't have to scare people back then to get them to understand the love of God. They could just talk about Jesus, and he was enough. His love was enough to convince people. But now we have to scare people. I don't know if it's because we're dumb and depressed, and we're discouraged, and so people think they need to scare us. I don't know. But it's become the norm. You hardly hear a sermon anymore that isn't trying to scare people. No wonder we grew up with guilt complexes. And then we don't know how to talk to God because the God we want to talk to is not a loving and patient parent who's ready to help us succeed. He's the judge that knows everything I ever did and is waiting to destroy me for it. Maybe that's you. I hope it isn't. And I hope if you're here long enough at this church that you grow beyond that capacity of seeing God like that you see God in the way that I see God, which is so lovely and inviting. But I still deal with guilt. I still deal with doubt. Sometimes I struggle with what God is really in control of. If I have freedom, but God is sovereign, what does that mean? Pro tip, no one knows. The church for 2,000 years have said it's a mystery, capital M mystery. We don't know. God is in control, but people have agency. We have volition of will, but God is in control. Well, which is it? Is God making the decisions or am I? Yes, both. Well, that's enough reason for me to doubt prayer. What good are my prayers if I'm not actually changing God's mind? But you are. Well, if I'm changing God's mind, is he in control or am I in control? Well, he's in control. Well, which is it, right? And I don't have an answer to that. That's the main struggle I do have with this point, is I still doubt what efficacy my prayers have. Not to mention, James says, the prayer of a righteous man availeth much. That eliminates me from the race, right? I do know some righteous people, but I'm not one of them. So do my prayers do anything? Am I wasting my breath? These are just some of the reasons that we don't pray as we should. Now, that's not the end of the sermon. Okay, now I do have 4 points about how we could understand prayer, sort of guiding principles. So that's what I'd like to talk about now. 4 guiding principles to help us in our prayer lives. But let's pause here before I mention these and make sure that you're still with me. Do you struggle with any of the things I just mentioned? Raise your hands if you do. Okay, hands back down. Raise your hands if you don't struggle with any of those things. Okay, good. That's what I thought. Well, if that's all of us struggling, then here are some tips for how we could better understand prayer and apply it in our lives. Include it. Apply it's a bad word. It's not something you apply. It's not a cream you put on your face, right? It's part, let me think of a better word. Incorporate into the rhythm of life. This is a set of principles to help you incorporate prayer into the rhythms of your daily life. And the last one is going to be about your daily life. Okay, point number 1. Prayer needs to be understood as union with God. That's where we start. I was not raised to think of prayer as union with God. I thought prayer was just talking at God, not with him even, just at him. Most of my early prayers were talking at God. Then I grew up and thought, oh no, it's a two-way conversation. I'm talking to God. He sometimes wants to talk to me, maybe not in an audible voice. Some of you maybe, but I've never heard the audible voice of God. But I've felt inclinations. I've felt the movement of the Spirit. You can't really quantify that, but I've felt it. I feel God moving and sort of whispering in a still small voice. Fine. But even that isn't enough. It's not talking to God and listening to God. It's more than that. It is union with God. It's more like marriage than it is a conversation. And that changes the way I view prayer. It involves lots of conversations, like a healthy marriage, but it's much deeper, more enduring, and more challenging than a conversation. Jesus said it this way in the Gospel of John, chapter 15. Abide in me as I abide in you. Abide in me. Jesus' example shows prayer as a way to remain deeply connected to the Father, a concept central to the desert fathers and mothers who saw prayer as abiding. I'm going to quote from a few of them because when I think about prayer, I think of monastic people who spend days upon days in solitude and prayer. And so, of course, I went back in my office and read from the desert fathers and the desert mothers and gained a lot of great insight. There's another great book from a modern pastor that you could read from California. Don't let that scare you, though. He's really a great moderate in most ways. But his name's John Mark Comer. I gave his book to all the high school graduates this year. It's called The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry. It's a really good book. I recommend it to you. But between him and some other authors I like to read and some of the early church leaders, I've discovered some consistent principles. That's where these points are coming from Scripture and church history. Jesus said, abide in me as I abide in you. Prayer is abiding. True prayer brings us to an awareness of God's indwelling presence, inviting us to be, as John 15 describes, branches connected to a vine. So Jesus says, my Father's a vine dresser, I'm a vine, you're the branches, you need to abide in me. You need to stay connected to me in order to stay healthy and produce fruit. Now that doesn't sound like a conversation a couple times a day. That sounds like a ceaseless communion, being connected and abiding. So if I don't think of prayer that way, then I'm already off on the wrong foot. You need to see prayer not as a duty, not as a job to perform, not as a conversation you need to have, but as a source of life, as the way you abide in the presence of God. That's first. Second, you have to let go of your need for control. And we talked about that the last 2 weeks, but we need to talk about it again, and probably every Sunday the rest of my life, because this is one of my biggest struggles. I don't pray well because I don't let go of control. Maybe that's why I struggle with the doubt part of like, what are my prayers even doing? Because even when I pray, if I don't sense that somehow I'm controlling something, then why am I doing it? Did you think about that earlier when I was talking? Some of you may have noticed at a psychological level, what I was describing was my own need to control my outcomes through prayer. Why do I care if I'm in control or if God's in control? Why do I care unless it's because I want to be in control? Right? If I really just trusted God, I wouldn't even ask that question. I would just pray. I would just pray. But deep down, I want to control the narrative. Matthew 6, verse 6, Jesus told us, when you pray, go into your room or your closet, close the door, and pray to your Father who is in secret. And he goes on and says, your Father who's in secret will reward you. God isn't waiting for you to broadcast your prayers. He doesn't need you to be talented at praying. He doesn't need you to prove anything in prayer. But more than that, prayer itself is an act of submission. You go to God with all the little nuances in your heart, and you say, here, take all of this. You're giving it to God in a secret place. It is a beautiful picture of handing it over in a private act. It is an intimate thing. So we abide with God so that we can hand things over to God. Jesus did this in Gethsemane. It wasn't a prayer in a closet with a door, but it was a prayer in a garden with no one around in the dead of night. And Jesus surrendered to God's will. That famous prayer, I don't want to drink the cup, but if I must, fine. Please take it from me, but I guess if I have to, I'll drink it. And he's back and forth with God. Do I need to do this? Do I have to do this? I guess I'm going to do this. Whatever you say, I'm going to do. And it's this crushing of the ego. Whatever human ego Jesus had, he submitted to God. That's what I want to do. I want to take me, the ego me, and stuff it underneath the feet of God's throne and trust him that he is sovereign, that he's good, that he knows what's best. Abba Pomen, which means shepherd father, which is kind of a cool name for a monk, he said true prayer will humble the ego, allowing us to release our desires. Prayer becomes a moment to let go of our agendas, our anxieties, and learn to trust God's timing and God's plan. Let go of your need to control things, your need to know the outcome before it comes to pass. If you can't do that, then you won't grow in your capacity for prayer. Number 3, there's only 2 more. Number 3, the transformative power of silence and solitude. So now beyond secret places and intimate places where I give things over to God, I do also need to not be distracted, right? I need to be in a place that's quiet, a place that's distant from others, a place that is, in modern speak, quarantined or something. I need to be separated from everything and everybody. This could be do not disturb turned on my phone, or silencing my calls and my texts. That would be step 1. Then going into an actual place of quiet, maybe outdoors, away from people, maybe into a closet with the door shut. I don't know. Wherever your place is, you need solitude. You need to go away. Psalm 46, verse 10, one of my favorite verses in the Psalter, says, "Be still and know that I am God." Be still and know that I am God. Be still and know that I am God. Be still and know. Be still. Be. It's amazing. Notice how often Jesus withdrew to silent places all over the Gospels. He would leave the people, the crowds, the popularity, the work, the busy work. He would leave it behind and go somewhere private, somewhere quiet, especially before any significant decisions had to be made. He would find solitude. Amos Eclectica said that silence creates space for the soul to meet God, free from worldly distractions. Silence creates space for the soul to meet with God, free from worldly distractions. I am free from worldly distractions roughly 5 seconds out of 24 hours a day, I would say. And that's like the seconds I'm waking up and falling asleep, which are mostly incoherent. So I'm really never fully awake and alert and not distracted by the world around me. And maybe that's you too. So prayer needs to be a state of solitude, at least at times, where I am away from distraction, where I am severed from all the ties that bind me here, so that I can commune with God. It's the equivalent of putting my phone on the table and turning it off when I go on a date with my wife, so that I look at her and talk to her and pay attention to her and not to all the other things around me and responding to things on my phone. It's the turning off of distractions. It's not just polite behavior. It's necessary to build real connections. Have you ever felt happy when a friend or loved one was talking to you while also trying to text people on their phone or respond to emails on their phone? That doesn't feel good. It doesn't feel connected. It feels distracted. And it makes you feel less important. Imagine how God feels every day, because he's pretty much always on my back burner. Be still and know that I am God. Silence can be a form of sacred listening. I think of the story of Elijah, the prophet, the great prophet Elijah. There was a scene where he spoke out against Queen Jezebel, a wicked queen married into Israel, and the false gods that she worshiped and the murder she had committed. And he spoke against her and against the king, and so she came for his head. She wanted to have him beheaded or at least somehow publicly executed. And he knew this, so he went into hiding. You may remember the story. He goes into a cave, and he's hiding, and there's a whirlwind, and there's a great fire, and it says God wasn't in the whirlwind, and God wasn't in the fire. And then there was a still small whisper, and God spoke to Elijah in a still small voice. And he said, "What are you doing? What are you doing?" And Elijah said, "I'm hiding. Jezebel wants to kill me. I'm the only one left who serves you in the whole kingdom." And then God says, "That's not right. Actually, I have like 70 other prophets that have not bowed the knee to Baal. You're definitely not the only one left who loves me. So get over yourself. But also, why are you hiding? You are a prophet of Yahweh. You just slaughtered 450 false prophets at the brook the other day, and now you're hiding?" That's another crazy story. It's fascinating that even people like Elijah, who have done these magnificent, amazing things for God, and sometimes violent things, that someone like that, with all that power and prestige and honor, would still feel the need to hide and not know where God is. And that he was surprised to find God in a still, small voice. Maybe we just misunderstand listening altogether. I used to think that the loudest voice is the one we should listen to. Of course, that's the opposite of the truth. I do remember when my mom would get really mad, she would whisper. She'd also turn red, but she would talk quietly, like she was grinding her teeth at us. And that was much scarier than all the times my dad yelled as loud as he could. I'm not sure I know why, but I know it's true. And so God speaks in a still, small voice. I need more quiet, attentive prayer in a noisy world. I'm waiting for God to break through all the noise and say something loud to me, and yet God has probably been whispering every day to me if I would just pay attention. Be still and know that I am God. Fourth and final point. Prayer has to be a ceaseless part of your life. If abiding with God is supposed to be a permanent, constant sort of thing, then prayer should be the same. If it's the source of abiding, if it's how we stay connected, then it needs to be a daily part of life. Not once a day or twice a day, but ceaseless throughout your day. That's complicated if you think of prayer as a conversation, but it's not if it is truly just abiding in the presence of God. That's something we could work to include in everything we say and do, in every part of life. 1 Thessalonians 5:17 is that famous verse, pray without ceasing. Pray without ceasing. Paul is speaking to a church, but I think it transcends Thessaloniki or Thessalonica. I think he's speaking to all Christians throughout the ages. Pray without ceasing. That's a word for all believers. How do I pray without ceasing? How do I pray all the time? Well, again, if I think of prayer as a conversation or making petitions and requests, then I can't. There's no way I could just do that all the time. You would have to become a monk and move out into solitude in the desert. But even then, you would be distracted. There would be days where you're filled with doubt, days where you are, not feeling well and not connected to God. Even then, you couldn't do it. That's why monasticism has shortcomings. That's why I'm not a monk out in the desert, because I see that only goes so far. But through them, I've learned lessons that I can incorporate in my real life, living here with all of you in the world. It has to be a rhythm of my day that I'm in communion with God. One way that Thomas Merton did this, he tried to see the image of God in every person. I think that's beautiful. Jesus taught that. Every time you do something for the least of these, you're doing it for me. That's me all around you. All those people bear my image. Every person you see, every person you touch, every person you hug or talk to, those people are me in the world. That's a profound thought. Every person you yell at, every person you roll your eyes to, every person you feel hatred or bitterness toward is Jesus in the world, an image bearer of God. That's heavy, but it makes me feel prayerful. If every time I interact with any person at all, I'm interacting with an image bearer of God, then I'm in communion with God at every moment. When I look in the mirror, I also am an image bearer of God, even to be in communion with myself. Maybe that's why Jesus said, love one another even as you love yourself, because you too bear the image of God. And so even to be awake and alert in my brain, sentient as I am, is to be in communion with God, if I think of it that way. But I don't. I just live my life like everybody else. And so I do not pray without ceasing. Ceaseless prayer means you have to find ways to recognize God's presence every moment of every day. All of life can be prayerful if we see God in the ordinary. If I can see in the loyalty of my dog when she comes to greet me in the morning when I put her food in her dish, if I can see the loyalty of a dog and recognize the faithfulness of God, then I am in prayer. If I look at my kids and feel this need to hug them and love them and send them off to school in the morning, and I recognize God as a perfect parent who feels all those wonderful things for me every day, then I am in prayer. If I see someone in need and feel a prick to the heart, this need to be compassionate, to help them, then I remember that God is merciful and compassionate, and I am in prayer. And as I help that person, I'm doing it for Jesus, which is an act of prayer and communion. If I were to see things differently, then I would recognize my life is prayer. But it's a perspective shift that you have to make. It's certainly not for those who are Sunday morning only Christians. If your goal as a Christian is to show up here each week to punch a ticket to heaven, none of this matters to you. But I know that's not the case. I know most of you, and I know quite a few of you really well, and I know you are good, loving, and kind people. And I know that your goal is to be in communion with God. So change your perspective. See everything as prayer, and watch what God will do in your life.